And you also told me I could call you Frans, so that's great. I don't need to use all these titles, which makes me feel much more comfortable. Thanks for this. So to kick off that conversation, Frans, could you set the stage by giving us an overview of what in its implementations? And because most of our audience will come either from business school or businesses or entrepreneurship, what's the role of business for its execution?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss something I believe passionately in, which is the European Green Deal. Why do we have a Green Deal? First of all, because the climate crisis is becoming increasingly urgent, and we can see it everywhere. You know, look at France, for instance. Droughts, harvests are really diminishing very quickly. We have erratic weather. You know all the phenomena. We have quickly disappearing biodiversity everywhere. So this is becoming a real and persistent threat to the survival of humanity. So we need to tackle. At the same time, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution. So things are changing anyway in our economy. It's an industrial revolution of incredible proportions, which is happening across the world at the same time to everyone. Nobody can escape. It will affect every human being on the planet, not just human beings. So in this context, we thought, what is it we need to do to make sure that the Paris Agreement actually is materialized? That means, how do we limit the rise in the Earth's temperature to maximum 1.5 degrees so that we don't reach tipping points that would create huge problems that are no longer under human control? That means you need to be climate neutral by 2050 in our analysis. Now, how to get to climate neutrality by 2050? You need a plan. And so you need to have targets for 2030, you need to have targets for 2040, 2045, etc. How do we get there? We need to decarbonize our economy. How do we decarbonize our economy? By structural reforms everywhere. Economy and society need to be decarbonized. The Green Deal is a plan to do all that. But it's a plan also for incorporating the positive sides of the industrial revolution into our plan making, and warding off the negative sides of industrial revolution in our plan. It will take us all these years, 2 generations of investments, a huge change to get where we need to be, but it can be done. Technologies are there. Not all of them developed enough. We need to invest in them. Finances have become incredibly more complicated because of the COVID crisis, but still it can be mobilized. I'll say something about that in a moment. The one thing that is lacking right now is enough political will and political concentration to get all of this moved. And I have to say, because you address the business community, especially big business is on board, because they understand they have to do the planning over decades. They understand we can't continue like this. So we need to change our energy mix. We need to change the way we produce and consume. We have to create a circular economy. We need to decarbonize some sectors that are incredibly difficult to decarbonize. Just imagine the steel sector. We can create green steel. We can use hydrogen for that, but we need to invest in doing that. So there are many things we need to do. And we thought we put a plan on the table so that we can exactly know which steps we need to take. Now, COVID came. And of course, initially, some people said, and you still sometimes hear it, but not very often, okay, nice, this Green Deal, but now we have a COVID crisis. First, we recover, and then perhaps we might come back to the Green Deal. Now, interestingly enough, especially in the financial sector, investors, banks, insurance companies, but also in big business, a consensus is growing and saying, no, we cannot afford to first rebuild the old economy, which will create masses of stranded assets in a couple of years' time. And then we will not have the financial means to actually transform our economy into the future. So we need to do it in one go. So on the one hand, the Green Deal is becoming more difficult because people have other other urgencies. You know, the Green Deal, climate crisis was the top urgency of our Europeans before the crisis. Now it is no longer, because people are obviously afraid that they might not survive or become ill or then lose their jobs, etc. So that's the priorities now. But we have to assure, so that's not making it easier. But what is making it somehow easier is that you have also business and the public sector, we have no choice. We cannot delay. We have to make big decisions on where we put the money we can mobilize, and we can only mobilize so much, and which means that choices can no longer be delayed or put off or only made half-heartedly. We need to use this period of necessary restructuring to make sure we prepare our society for the time that is coming. So both in terms of the Industrial Revolution and everything it entails, and in making sure that we reach climate neutrality by 2050. It can be done. And so what did we change? What we changed is that the priorities we had in the Green Deal are now tailored also to doing things that have immediate results. So just to give you one example, and otherwise I speak too long, I'm just looking forward to the questions. One example, we want to create a renovation wave, which means we want to immediately roll out all over the European Union a wave by which homes and office buildings are renovated so that they become much more energy efficient, that you change the energy sources, that you make that sustainable, that you bring insulation, that you improve the whole infrastructure surrounding that, that you electrify a lot of things so that you also have chargers everywhere. And it has an immediate effect, because in some parts of Europe, the biggest problem now is air quality. You immediately improve air quality through that. You reduce emissions drastically. You avoid what is called energy poverty, so that the energy bill would go up too much and people cannot afford it. And you immediately create jobs, because this cannot be delocalized. These are jobs that will have to take place where you renovate the buildings. And the building industry is interesting because it covers huge enterprises, but also SMEs to a large extent. It covers highly complicated things, but also manual labor, etc. So just to give you one example where we believe the Green Deal can have an immediate positive result also on economic recovery. And I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward.
Thanks, Frans. So before we get, I'll let Kevin go into the heart of some of the questions we received beforehand. 3 quick clarification points I'd like to hear from you for part of our audience who might not be so familiar with these issues. What do you mean specifically by carbon neutrality, by decarbonization? And finally, it's called the Green Deal. What's the inclusion dimension of that, if it has any?
Well, first of all, what we want to do is obviously reduce emissions. And you can reduce emissions also with partly non-renewable energy sources. I'm talking to somebody in France, exactly the role of nuclear energy. But we also have to say nuclear energy is not sustainable. At the end of the day, we need to move to renewable energy sources. And that's solar, that's wind, and they're taking off. I mean, if you look at the price developments in that sector, it is astonishing how quickly the price has fallen there. And if you look back over during the crisis over the last months, investment in the energy sector has plummeted, except for renewables. There it is still present, not at the levels we need, but people see the future in that. So we really need renewable energy. But wind and solar is not going to be enough. We need thermal energy, and we need an energy carrier that is completely decarbonized. And hydrogen, I think, is an element in that could be very useful. Now, my deep conviction is that such fundamental societal change can only happen if you have the support of the population. And you can only get the support of the population if everybody feels part of it. And one of the biggest risks we run now, politically and also I would say economically, is that too large parts of our population don't believe it's about them. They believe they will only have extra cost, but no benefit. So that's why we say it's a Green Deal. We say we leave no one behind. This is a huge, huge claim that we need to materialize very concretely. And for that, we need to make sure that we discuss with all member states their national recovery plans and make sure that they move in this direction without leaving anybody behind.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frans. So you started touching on this in the introduction. I mean, given the current context and the COVID crisis that we are experiencing today, I'd be really, curious to understand your view on, really how this is impacting the Green Deal roadmap. And what it's true that the crisis could be an accelerating force for the transition. We also see clear friction points, with the urgent economic recovery needs and the country's debt level. So, what do you see is the impact on your roadmap, and what is your strategy to ensure that the European countries keep putting environment and social change on top of their agendas?
Well, what we're trying to do is now, as we speak, these weeks, is to get consensus with all member states on the recovery plan and on the next 7 years budget for the EU. If we get consensus on that, then of course the recovery plan will come with conditionalities for spending the money. And these conditionalities should be deeply embedded in three priorities: the Green Deal, digitization of our economy, and increasing Europe's resilience. These are three priorities we have named, and there is consensus in the Council with member states that this should be our priorities. Now, of course, now we will have to, so the good thing is there is consensus about this, and the good thing is initially 1 or 2 member states said, well, forget about this Green Deal. We'll come back to the first recovery. But this is gone. Everybody's saying we understand now we need the Green Deal, digitization, as our growth strategy to recover from this crisis. That's nice. It's nice to get this political support. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. What are the plans concretely going to do? And there I have to say to you that once in September, October, November, we will start seeing the real painful consequences of the COVID crisis. And then I hope, politicians, I'm a politician myself, I know what happens when there is a huge crisis, and politicians and they are tempted to throw money at everything just to keep things going. And then I hope we can stick to a master plan, that we put the money where it is profitable also in the future, where it helps transformation and creates jobs and profits in the future. I'm also saying this because this crisis will mean that we will have to increase substantially debt, substantially. And this will be on the shoulders of our children. So what proposition do we have for our children? We're going to borrow from you and then stick it in the old economy that is not going to profit you, and not do anything about the climate crisis that's going to be an extra burden for you? No, I think the only way we could justify borrowing this amount of money, which will be on the shoulders of our children, is to say, but with this money, we will create a better society, a fairer society, economic growth in the future, jobs of the future, and we will be on the road for climate neutrality by 2050.
Thank you, Frans, on this. So let's talk now about solutions. We at ChangeNOW, we love talking about solutions, and yesterday you revealed the EU strategy for energy systems and hydrogen. Could you tell us a little bit more on your strategy in terms of hydrogen and energy systems, and also more generally speaking, what are the most promising solutions that are supported by the Green Deal that you see in key sectors such as energy, transport, infrastructure, agriculture? Which are the solutions?
Well, let's start with energy systems. We see now that it is extremely inefficient and divided. And to give you one example, a very, very concrete example, in housing across the European Union, very often it is individually heated by gas boilers, sometimes even coal boilers, etc. This has a huge emissions impact. At the same time, we have industrial complexes and we have an increasing number of data centers where huge amounts of heat are produced that are just left into the environment and are not doing anything useful. We should create an energy system where the heat produced in one process can be used to provide heating of housing and offices in another process. This is system integration. Just one example, because the issue of data centers that will be built everywhere is going to be a huge environmental challenge because they produce so much heat. And instead of cooling it on the spot, which is a double loss of energy, you could use that heat and heat other places with. Just one example of systems integration. But the other thing is, we know that renewable energy, especially wind and solar, will take off like a rocket everywhere, offshore wind, etc. But then you produce enormous amounts of energy in one spot and you can't get it to another spot. And we saw last week, earlier this week actually, we saw negative energy prices. Why? Because there was a lot of sun and a lot of wind, and all this energy could not be distributed. So the price went below zero. That's bad. So we need systems that can bring the energy where it is needed, when it is needed, and that can store the energy if there is excess energy. For that, we need hydrogen. Because you cannot transport electricity from the North Sea to the south of Italy through a cable. That doesn't work. You have too much loss and it's too expensive. But you can transport energy through hydrogen from one part of Europe and even from Africa to Europe and back, etc. So that in that system, hydrogen plays a role for a number of reasons. First of all, because it can store energy. You can transport it over long distances. And now that the prices are falling of renewable energy, especially, just imagine how cheap hydrogen you can produce in the North Sea with these latest generation wind turbines. And then this hydrogen can be used in processes, not just to store the energy and to transport it, but also in difficult to abate sectors where you cannot use electricity for processes. In the steel industry, I mentioned it already, in the cement industry, in parts of the chemical industry, but also for heavy transport. Electricity, EVs, electric vehicles will probably not be sufficient for heavy transport. So you need fuel cells driven by hydrogen. And then on the basis of hydrogen, you can also create sustainable fuels for airplanes, for shipping. So that's how we approach the issue. And I have to say, it also helps the energy sector transit to sustainability, because I'm talking about hydrogen produced with renewable energy. It used to be called green hydrogen. We don't use that anymore, but just so that the audience understands. But there's also hydrogen produced with gas, sometimes even with coal. We don't want that anymore. But if you can have gas decarbonized through carbon capture and storage, then again, that is also low emission hydrogen. Also hydrogen produced by nuclear energy, which is not sustainable, but it is very low emission. So hydrogen is also a way of transiting from the present situation to a renewable situation, and it will offer the possibility for industry to adapt in a way that is feasible.
So thank you, Frans. So very concretely, for European businesses and entrepreneurs who are already convinced, or you just managed to convince right now, because I think that's what you're doing, are there any specific subsidies or help that they can benefit from to move that way starting now?
The thing is, we do understand that if you want to come out of this crisis, the package we need to decide on has to have three elements. First, it has to be quick. And that is also my appeal, especially also to my own country. There is no time to waste, really. The longer this takes, the more difficult it becomes, the bigger the differences will be, and the social devastation could be huge. So it has to be quick. The second element is it has to be proportionate to the challenge. So it has to be big enough to actually make an impression on the markets, on private partners, and really have an impact in terms of the investment that is possible. And thirdly, it has to create a level playing field in the internal market. For many, many reasons, we cannot afford individual member states in the internal market falling on their knees because of this. So it is in the interest of the internal market and all the member states together to make sure we create a level playing field. We want to say it differently to show solidarity with those countries that are hardest hit, which at this stage is clearly in our predictions, Italy, Spain, and France. So this is why also I believe the German government had such a change in position, because they understand this fundamental survival mode for the European Union. And it's not just for the market. The internal market is also the biggest asset we have in geopolitical terms. Yeah. It defines Europe's power in the world, the internal market. Not our army, not our air force, not our navy, but the internal market and the rules that come with that. So we really want this to happen. So what does this mean concretely in terms of finances? If the package is adopted that we have, we in React EU, we can immediately mobilize 55 billion euros for investment in concrete things that will help recovery. Then, of course, we will continue with our programs, the LIFE program and other programs that foster and stimulate research in many areas, and really want to partner up with the private sector on that. And then, of course, we will make sure that if we have a budget for the next 7 years, the traditional budget instruments, such as the structural funds and the agricultural policy, are transformed into helping those sectors adapt to the situation and transform into a modern sector. And the challenge for the agricultural sector will be huge, but we need to mobilize the funds for that. And in the structural funds, we can help with what I said, the renovation wave, helping industries restructure. Because this is one thing, finally, I want to say. I think the more we know, because we do deep dives into the different economic sectors in Europe, the more we know, the more we see that the need for restructuring will be huge. And I when I talk to people in the automotive industry, in the metal industry, in the cement industry, etc., they are daunted. It's daunting. They are really challenged, because they will have to go through restructuring, which is going to be extremely complicated, and we need to stand by their side. But we also need to keep them on track for restructuring that leads to crisis, where we put way too much money in an economy that had no future. That we should not be doing.
So if I pick up on two things that you just mentioned, the need for restructuring and also the potential geopolitical influence of these changes, we have some questions, and thank you for starting to ask them, coming in that are asking or putting them back at you. Number one, do we need to structurally change the Europe, the way we are structured, to be able to implement the Green Deal? Number one. And number two, is there where does that Green Deal fit in the international landscape and our efforts, with the US, with China, with Africa? How does that fit in that international landscape, and what are the opportunities there for Europe?
First of all, I do strongly believe that Europe's credibility is not founded on its military might. And although I understand and support efforts to improve our military capacity, which is wise to do, whatever we do in that field will not greatly impress Americans or Chinese in terms of the choices the world has to make. Where we do impress, the Green Deal impresses. They are curious. Even though at this stage everybody's focused on COVID, obviously, they're curious about this. And if you know anything about Europe's history, strength is in. It sounds very almost very bureaucratic, but our strength is in our regulations. Our strength is in norm setting. I remember very well. That's the advantage of being a bit older. I remember very well when Jacques Delors came with his plan to create the internal market. Everybody would say, "Oh my God, such high norms! We will no longer be competitive in the world." But the opposite was true. The high norms we set for the internal market, everybody wanted to be on the internal. So the rest of the world adapted to the high norms. We also saw it recently on the protection of data. Data protection is set. The norm is set by Europe, and the rest are following that. So we should never lose track of that power. the European Union. Now, how do I see this in a global context? First of all, you know, between now and November, we will see quite choppy seas, if I can put it that way. Until the American election, I think we will see we will have to brace for some surprising moves, and we will have to be prepared to stand up for our own position. Secondly, we have become far more direct and clear in our relationship with China about the things we don't like. And recently, the President, von der Leyen and Michel had a meeting like this one with Xi Jinping. It was supposed to last 45 minutes. It lasted 2 hours. And things were said very clearly by both sides. And then a letter followed from the Chinese saying exactly what their grievances were. So that's how Europe plays a role, not by shying away from also mentioning the things we don't like. But then we have to also make sure we increase our resilience. COVID has shown that in some of our sectors, if you look at our what Thierry Breton calls our economic ecosystems, we have some holes in them. Because if we can't even get our own basic medication because it's only produced in India, we have to rethink whether that is in our interest. And also in other areas, how do we protect our strategic assets? Do we invent things and then it is immediately flown to China and then used against us within 5 years' time? No, we can't afford to do that. The intellectual property and the industrial capacity of Europe also needs to be more resilient. And that means also talking tough in international relations. Now, one word of caution here. It's going to be really, really a fine line between increasing our resilience, standing up for what we believe in, and then not falling into the trap of a competition that leads to a level of protectionism that really hurts the economy everywhere. That's going to be how we reinvent that, how we reinvent international trade, how we make sure that the values we cherish as Europeans are an integral part and a part that can be controlled in our trade agreements. These are some of the big challenges we will face, also to play our geopolitical role.
Thanks a lot, Frans, for this. We're going to move shortly to the Q&A, and thank you again for all those great questions that are being asked. One just final question before we hand it over to the audience. You saw recently, in the past few days, weeks, we've spoken a lot in France about the French Citizens Climate Convention. And for the audience that didn't see it, it basically consisted in having a pool of hundreds of French citizens that were randomly selected to produce environmental recommendations in collaboration with experts. And they presented 149 recommendations to President Macron, who recently gave green light on about 146 of them, which is quite extraordinary. So my question to you, Frans, is do you think there is an opportunity today in Europe to scale such efforts in other European and non-European actually countries? And two, do you see opportunities for European citizens to engage directly with the European Green Deal?
We're going to create a forum for that, the Climate Pact, to see if we can get as many people engaged with this. But I think there's a more fundamental point here, and I think France is the case in point. I like this innovation. For those who don't know, I lived in France. I studied in France. I think I know the country quite well. I like this innovation, which I think should be copied. Perhaps not in this form, because it's also particular to the political culture and wider culture of the country. So everybody should use their own method for this. But democracy needs to be renovated. If you are a modern person, a young person, and every night you can watch television and watch the voice of France or the voice of I don't know which country, and you can vote, you can give your opinion, and immediately it's taken into account. But in politics, you get a chance every 4 or every 5 years to express your views in a very, very global and compact way, and you have to make all sorts of compromises with your own ideas. I would say make it far more attractive for people to be engaged more directly in some of the choices we need to make. It gives responsibility to our citizens, and it gives accountability to politicians. So you then get this more of a direct dialogue, which is much more in tune with our day and age of so many possibilities of direct contact and direct dialogue. And then it doesn't mean that politicians don't have to do what comes out of it, but at least they have to account for why they're not doing it or why they're doing it. And I believe this, we urgently need to reinvest in our democracy, because I am worried about two things in Europe. Fundamentally, really about two things. About too many young people saying, well, democracy might not be that good for the challenges we face, because I am deeply, deeply convinced of democracy. There is no better system to govern, because any other system would be detrimental to the position of who is weak and who is in a minority position. So liberal democracy is, I think, not just the past, it must be refurbished and reinvented for the future. The second point, I think, is also that if you do not create more participation of people, they will turn their backs to it. And then you get, because the fear of loss is the biggest fear in especially the middle class and lower middle classes across the Western world, the fear of loss. And some politicians are able to weaponize that fear of loss, and on the basis of that fear of loss, create hatred against who's not seen as part of the herd, of the community, of the tribe. And then you get these theories of we will be replaced, etc. Well, look what Goulven is writing in France. You see it all over the place. And where we are driven into the Green Deal because of young people mobilizing on Fridays for Future and telling us what to do, which is good. We also see a part of our young generation tempted by undemocratic speeches, undemocratic ideas, and especially this idea that we will be replaced by others and therefore have to fight others and throw them out. This is for a society like ours the most threatening ideology, which needs to be confronted. And I'm not sure we're always confronting it.
But so how do we do that concretely? Because that's extremely important. You started by saying also at the beginning that basically we were overburdening with debt for recovery, with debt of climate change to the next generations. They are getting activated for change now. They will also suffer unemployment in the years to come due to that crisis. So how do we engage them concretely, these young people?
Well, are we able to show that that the tunnel is not that long and dark, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not the light of a train coming your way? How do we show that? How do we show concretely that if you engage in this, you will also profit from it? And I believe, again, coming back to my initial point, something like the renovation wave can prove that. Something like stimulating the production of electric vehicles and the change from combustion engine to electric vehicles can do that. Creating jobs in the hydrogen economy, creating jobs in the renewable energy economy, making sure that our social systems are maintained. The thing is, mostly when society is changing profoundly, if you are optimistic about your position in the society that comes, you'll accept a temporary downturn or temporary setback. But if your feeling is that anything happens will lead to more loss, change means loss, then you will resist any form of change. And there's too much of that in our society, and we need to prove with facts that we will leave no one behind. And again, talking about France, if you look at the latest French elections, of course, it is, from my position, of course, very, very interesting to see that there is a green wave in the cities. But in the rural areas, the situation is different. And we cannot afford this chasm between urban areas and rural areas in our society. We also need to bring those closer together. So that means for a European policy, we have to have an agricultural policy that actually looks more after the income of people in farming communities and not how we bring money to big landowners.
Some of our audience members are asking in addition to the investment in this new model, what is Europe doing in terms of taking action to prohibit the most harmful activities, in the offshore oil and gas drilling, etc. These activities which are not compatible with a new Green Deal. What are your views on this?
Well, we should stop investment in it. We should stop public support for it. I think the European Investment Bank has shown the way in that direction. I would make one exception temporarily because I think in this transition, both natural gas and nuclear will continue to play a role to help the transition along. They are not the solution, but they are part of the transition. But we may have to make sure, and I mean, the markets are already dictating this. Even the big oil companies understand this, that the investment will go into renewable energy. It's happening as we speak. We have to provide long-term predictability. That's what public authorities can do. And we have to provide the right conditions for the investments to be successful. Sometimes it's with seed money or co-investing. Sometimes it's really just regulation. And this is what in the last couple of months, the sectors have been asking me for. Give us predictability, long-term predictability. Don't change mid-course. Give us a long-term view and stick to it. And then help us with regulation to get where we need to be. And then in some sectors, help us also with subsidies and grants so that we can get there.
Thank you, Frans. I'm going to take one last question. I'm really sorry. I mean, we won't be able to cover all of them. But thank you again for participating and being so involved. So there was a question from Sep Musavi, who's asking about impact investing and how, the importance of impact investing that requires a shift from a capitalistic view of investment to a green mindset, which means that investors shouldn't be focused on financial returns, but also on ESG returns. What is your view on that? And do you think this is a shift that could be happening soon in the future? Or, what's your take on this?
Well, there are different. I'm optimistic about this. But to do that, we need to make sure we put a price on this. If you go back and certainly, as a linguist and historian and lawyer, I certainly don't want to lecture economists here, and most of you are. But traditionally, you would see two production factors, labor and capital, and the relationship between the two, etc. But in this modern economy, we should expand the vision production factors are. Yes, labor, yes, capital, but data is now a production factor that was unaccounted for before. The fact that billions of people are giving away their data for free, and then some data companies are making billions on that without the citizens. Yeah, they get the information, but they don't get any societal returns on that. We need to change that, and quite quick. And then there is what one could call Gaia, or the natural environment, nature. Nature is limited. It's a limited resource. It's a scarce resource. And we need to think about how we share scarce resources. And this has to be reflected in our tax systems. And it's not that taxation does not take this sufficiently into account. It has to be made visible. We have to be aware of our behavior. As soon as you're aware what your behavior is doing, you will change your behavior. And so there are fiscal elements, political elements, economic elements, moral elements. People sometimes underestimate the moral factor. Many people in businesses want to do the morally right thing. This idea that everybody in business is sort of a Gordon Gekko on steroids is completely false. You want to be seen as a business that does the right thing. Then you get the best people to work for you, and you get the best customers. So I honestly believe it's a combination of all these factors. But the bottom line, and I see this with these big investors across the world, the bottom line is they know that if you do the wrong investment, those assets will be frozen and lost to you and will have no return. So that's why I think you see this increasing interest in green investment. I think I'm on this, I'm quite optimistic. The only thing that we need to do is to overcome the present situation. We need to get out of this hole. And once we get out of this hole, I think we have a huge opportunity to transform our society to the benefit of the whole of society into a sustainable society.
And because you mentioned the tax world, I'm just going to squeeze a final question that we have from some of our audience members. What about a carbon tax at the European borders? Any chance that we would have something like that, that would be a lever to reduce emission and mitigate climate change while preserving employment in Europe? What's your view on that?
As you know, we've introduced an emissions trading system, which is actually very successful, and it even weathered the crisis in a way that I would not have thought possible. The price is even up of carbon right now, around 30 euros a ton, which shows that this trading of carbon works. It changes the behavior of enterprises, and it does create a market that leads to decarbonization. So when we take the measures we're talking about, decarbonizing our industry, etc., because we want to comply with the Paris Agreement, we will say to our international partners who have also signed the Paris Agreement, what are your plans to get there? And if they have plans, then we do not need to have a correction at the border, because then there is no risk of carbon leakage and there is no risk of false competition. But if they don't have the plans and we continue to decarbonize our economy, we need to protect our industry now. But we have to do it in a very targeted way. We need to look at the different sectors, the different industries which are affected by this. You know, steel, for instance, runs a risk of being affected by this, and several other industries. And then we will have to introduce a targeted carbon border adjustment. And I am willing to defend this in WTO and anywhere, because what we are doing is complying with an international agreement, which is the Paris Agreement. And we can expect of other signatories of the Paris Agreement to do the same. If they don't do that, we are completely entitled to protect our industry that does the right things, so that we don't get carbon leakage and that we don't get, for instance, very dirty steel dumped on the European market at the expense of the European steel producers who are trying to do the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frans. Thank you, Katell. So we're running out of time, so we're gonna end our discussion for today. It was absolutely lovely to be with you, Frans, today. Thank you again for sharing your insights, and I'm just going to summarize a few takeaways. We've heard from you a really ambitious vision behind a Green Deal. To see Europe become carbon neutral by 2050 is quite a strong ambition, and we've seen that you have targets by 2025, 2030, 2040 that would need to be planned year on year onwards, and that basically that strategy to decarbonize the economy will need structural reforms basically everywhere in all the sectors. And we are really counting on your leadership to be able to lead the structural reforms that will allow for this shift and for this transition. We've also heard from you, how the Europe could be really a leader in the world to in terms of environmental transition, and I think the main thing here today is the main challenge that we're facing is how do we turn this fear of loss into a sea of hope? And for that, we need to stop opposing environmental change with the economic needs. Actually, there is a possibility, there is an opportunity behind this environmental transition that could be an incredible provider of jobs, provider of wealth as well. And as you several times you mentioned the example of the construction industry and how it can be a provider of jobs locally. This is the key: is how do we show that the path forward is going to be through an ecological and social transition for the future. And I think that's the main element that we take away from today's talk. So hopefully, Frans, we will see you again in Paris in March next year. As you know, from the 9th to the 11th, we'll be welcoming more than 1,000 change makers from all around the planet that are actually acting every day for this transition with solutions. Many of those solutions will be actually supported by the Green Deal, and there will be a lot of innovations in terms of hydrogen, for example. So I'm officially inviting to attend this summit from the 9th to the 11th of March and we will have time to discuss it in the months to come. And thank you again, Katell, and our dear partner, the Hoffmann Global Institute for Business and Society. It's been amazing partnering with you for the past 2 years, and I'm really looking forward for the next for continuing this collaboration. This is the last ChangeNOW live talk for the first half of the season. We'll be taking a break this summer, but we'll be coming back in September and with another talk with again you, Katell, and we'll be sharing more on this very soon. Everyone, have a lovely summer, and we'll be in touch very soon. Thank you again, Frans.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Katell.
Bye bye to everyone. Bye.